America is addicted to cars. It's like a drug or a bad relationship that we keep coming back to. It gives us a rush of dopamine, an important neurotransmitter in the brain every time we drive, or buy or lease a new model nearly every 4 to 6 years, which is the average rate for American families. It gives us a sense of power and control over our lives, and yet makes us insanely mad at traffic and other bad drivers on the road. However, what we continue to ignore, not just in Detroit but as a whole country, is that cars are a silent killer, one that is part of the leading cause of longevity decline in the US, more than the opioid crisis. In 2015, the traffic fatality rate jumped 9%, and in 2016 another 5.6%, which is the biggest 2-year jump in 50 years. Due to cars, our death rate per capita is nearly twice that of Canada and France. On top of that, Americans are spending almost more money on transportation than they are on housing. Transportation is eating up as much as 22% of a family's budget, with the highest costs being in Houston, Atlanta, Dallas, Miami, Detroit, and Minneapolis. One study says urban sprawl is driving up transportation costs. As Roy Kinitz of the Surface Transportation Policy Project says, now driving is an expensive necessity. People are wedded to their cars. It's not a choice anymore. Cars, like a drug, are blocking us from seeing the possibilities on the other side. Our predicament today was brought about by decisions made long ago by people in power, who were, and still are, of a certain sex and color. Beginning in the 1930s, people in government sought a solution to failing streetcar companies, white flight, and growth in populations. However, they did not foresee that choosing automobiles and an extensive highway system would have rippling ramifications across space and time. It left us tied to cars without another viable option, and created enormous fractures and rifts between cultures, income levels, ethnicities, and countless neighborhoods. The building of highways, funded in the 50s, 60s, and 70s by the federal government, sealed the deal and chained American society to a fatal and divisive system. Highway engineers were largely in charge of placement and design, and had little regard for how highways would impact the urban fabric, as they only cared about efficiency. Others in power had ulterior motives. They wanted to bring suburban commuters back to the city, and they purposely targeted lower-income urban communities for elimination. Under the guise of quote-unquote urban renewal and the Federal Highway Act of 1956, over 48,000 miles of highway were built, resulting in the demolition and removal of over 475,000 households and displacement of over 1 million people. In addition, due to discriminatory practices like redlining, these disadvantaged peoples were driven further into isolation, disenfranchisement, and eventually destruction. Most notably in Michigan, Detroit's majority African-American neighborhoods called Black Bottom and Paradise Valley were torn to shreds to make way for Lafayette Park and the shortest highway in America. I-375 is only 1.1 miles long and was built right through this area, which has significant historical and cultural importance. Black Bottom derived its name from the dark, fertile topsoil that was once a part of the riverbed of the now-buried Savoyard Creek. It once held many black-owned businesses, a bustling nightlife, and had major contributions to music like blues, big band, and jazz, and has ties to people like Aretha Franklin, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, and boxer Joe Louis. Only the wealthiest, influential people in other cities were able to stop some highways from being built through their neighborhoods, such as Washington, D.C., and plans for I-78 through Manhattan. In 1981, the Motor Vehicle Franchise Act in Michigan gave car dealerships power, and as a result, they became extremely influential economically and politically, which furthered these divisions. Meanwhile, these disadvantaged communities are still being disproportionately affected today. There is a massive lack of identity felt within these neighborhoods that were left in shambles, a huge struggle with accessibility to resources, continuous health issues such as asthma, and battles with failing infrastructure that cause severe flooding with almost every rain event. In addition, worsening traffic, car crashes, and high speeds in America continue to wreak havoc on people's lives. So, how do we go about the process of healing and rewiring our cities and minds? In order for people to have the mental capacity to deal with the immediate looming cloud of climate change, we need to give land and equal access to that land back to the people. Many may have heard of the phrase, "you cannot pour from an empty cup." For all of us to be on board with facing climate change, we need to start with the most obvious barriers first. We can start by dismantling automobile highways and all the negativity they stand for, and propose a transportation option that is better than cars. This is where high-speed rail comes in. HSR, for short, has a smaller footprint than highways, is more energy efficient as it runs on electricity, produces less pollution and CO2, and carries many more people at once than one person per car. In addition, it cuts door-to-door travel times by more than half, and reduces travel stress, which would then increase quality of life overall. A two-pronged approach of elevated HSR in urban areas and green bridges in rural areas would allow increased connectivity of both people and wildlife across restored spaces that were originally taken up by miles and miles of asphalt and concrete. Existing highway footprints will be utilized and converted into HSR. As a quick example, China has already heavily invested in HSR, and today, more than half of their commuters use HSR over domestic flights or cars. The historical context shows what Detroit's map used to look like before highways, and then after, we can see how highways spread across the landscape. We can then see where my site of interest lies. I propose an extension to Clark Park, which will break through the barrier of I-75 underneath a new elevated HSR line, and in future phases will eventually reach the Detroit River shoreline. My site of interest is very close to the entrance point from Canada and currently consists of empty lots and gravel dumps. An elementary and high school sit adjacent to Clark Park, which places vulnerable children and families at much higher risk for the long-term effects associated with continuous exposure to diesel fuels and pollution. The empty lots will be converted and serve many new purposes: restore native habitat, areas for recreation, stormwater management and filtration, and carbon sequestration. The following two typologies are proposed to show how HSR and green bridges can help solve current transportation issues and help connect people back to nature and the landscape. In urban areas, an elevated HSR will be beneficial because of the tremendous amount of existing infrastructure at the ground level. We also want to avoid the difficulty and costs of tunneling. Detroit already has plans to demolish a part of I-375 and has some elevated rail in the downtown area. This system could be integrated into the overall HSR network. In rural areas, a green bridge scheme is proposed to streamline the efficiency and safety of HSR throughout the country. HSR, while lacking in speed in smaller countries like Europe, has the potential to reach its optimal speeds due to the great distances between America's major cities. We will talk more about green bridges and their benefits shortly. Here is the site plan for the urban area, focusing on an extension to Clark Park. Based on local information, Clark Park is widely used and loved by the surrounding neighborhood. However, the area that butts up to I-75 is excessively loud, full of pollution from the heavy traffic on Ambassador Bridge, which presents physical and health dangers to the locals. With HSR elevated above the park extension, the green space below is reserved solely for people and urban wildlife to cross safely. This allows the Mexican Town and Southwest Detroit neighborhoods to have open access to the other side of I-75. Perceived safety is a huge factor in whether people will use a space or not. Narrow, unattractive pedestrian bridges do exist for people to cross over the highway, but people rarely use them. This plan emphasizes the focus on space for people, not cars. Elevators bring people up to the HSR transportation decks, and bike lanes will become a large part of the access roads that once led to I-75. The rest of the site includes adaptive stormwater technology to prevent CSOs, or combined sewer overflows, plenty of space for recreation, restored habitat for wildlife, and a space for performances and festivals which commemorates the blues and jazz history of Detroit. This section shows HSR during dusk, emphasizing the details of lighting for safety. Based on an analysis of the historic natural community structures of the area, vegetation underneath the HSR, which would have been I-75, will be restored to a wet prairie habitat and include plants such as Sargassum nutans and Calamagrostis canadensis. In the higher topographic areas, upland communities of beech sugar maple and oak hickory forests will be reestablished. Based on rough calculations, trees planted in the 13-acre Phase 1 site area have the potential to absorb almost 200,000 pounds of CO2 and intercept more than 2 million gallons of rainwater each year. This map shows how accessible the proposed HSR transport hub is from either side of the I-75 corridor, with a quick 5 or 10 minute walk or bike ride. Adaptive stormwater systems, which is proposed in a paper by Kirkes et al. In 2016, involves the installation of sensors and valves in different areas of stormwater capture and flow. The SMART system works together to detect changes in water quality and levels when rainstorms occur. It is a relatively quick, simple, and low-cost way to retrofit existing drainage systems and allows them to help prevent harmful CSOs. This innovative, real-time sensing and control system, which was implemented in South Bend, Indiana in 2008, has already proven to significantly decrease CSOs. Now let's zoom back out. Detroit sits at the crossroads of some major transportation ways. I-75 stretches all the way to Miami, Florida, and east to west, Detroit sits in the middle of Chicago and Toronto. Detroit has the potential to be a major hub for economic growth and as a stop on a larger HSR network. So if HSR is to stretch along all of I-75 in the future, we must also think about how HSR might interact with more rural landscapes outside of city centers. In rural areas, green bridges will save both animals and people from a lot of headaches, injuries, thousands of dollars of costs, and fatalities. In 2019, Michigan had over 50,000 motor vehicle deer crashes, which made up almost 18% of the total crashes in Michigan. According to State Farm, Michigan is second in the U.S. for vehicle collisions with animals. It's also estimated that 50% of vehicle large animal collisions go unreported. Thus, the necessity of investment in the building of green bridges is necessary now to prevent more collisions in the future, especially if HSR is to replace I-75 and other highways. Places such as the Trans-Canada Highway and Brandenburg, Germany, have already shown the success of green bridges not only in decreasing the number and costs of wildlife vehicle collisions, but also their positive role in supporting the re-establishment of dwindling keystone species, such as wolves, by increasing habitat connectivity in an increasingly fragmented landscape. This animation shows how a green bridge might look crossing over HSR in a rural area outside of Detroit. Green bridges also have the potential to have multiple types of designs. Some can be hybrid, meaning it allows pedestrians and other types of transport to cross over, but there is one side of the bridge that is dedicated to natural plantings for wildlife to also cross. Green bridges and HSR can be a positive experience for all of us, wildlife and humans alike, and help us see the world of movement and transportation differently than we're used to. Transportation does not have to be stressful, time-consuming, and expensive. Reinforcement through positive urban and nature experiences will help us get away from the destructive cycle of car culture and improve people's lives by many magnitudes. Because like the 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion connections in our brain, everything in the world around us is also connected. But we must advocate for these changes at every level if we are to see large-scale changes for the better. I hope that we can shift our paradigm and invest in different types of transport, such as HSR, that are truly accessible and equitable. We can then hope to heal our landscapes and broken connections, improve mental and physical health among historically and presently disadvantaged neighborhoods, and move forward to face climate change together. Thank you for listening to my presentation.